In the frozen town of Copperwells, a broken judge thought he was hunting his family's killer. He never imagined the woman he'd fallen in love with had been raising his supposedly dead son for 15 years. But when the past refuses to stay buried, sometimes the greatest mercy comes from the most unexpected hearts. Hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of redemption, love, and second chances in the untamed West. Judge who lost everything found love with the sister of his family's killer. The Montana Territory. Winter of 1885 was particularly cruel to the living and equally indifferent to the dead. Snow fell in thick, suffocating curtains across the landscape, turning the world into a monochrome painting where hope went to die. Through this frozen wilderness rode Elijah Cross, former territorial judge turned wandering ghost, his breath forming silver clouds that dissipated as quickly as his faith in justice once had. 15 years. 15 years since that October night when everything he believed in burned to ash along with his home outside Helena. 15 years since he last wore the black robes of judicial authority, since he last believed that law and order meant anything more than pretty words scrawled on parchment by men who had never felt true loss. Copperwells emerged from the blizzard like a mirage of civilization, though Elijah suspected it was more graveyard than town. The buildings leaned into each other as if seeking warmth from their neighbors, their windows glowing amber against the hostile white landscape. Smoke rose from perhaps a dozen chimneys, not many souls left to tend fires in this dying corner of the territory. His horse, a sturdy mare named Justice, a name that had seemed less ironic 15 years ago, picked her way carefully down the main street. Ice cracked beneath her hooves like the breaking of promises. Elijah's pale blue eyes, once warm with compassion for those who came before his bench, now scanned the empty streets with the calculating coldness of a predator. He had come here following a whisper, a rumor carried by a drunk in a Billings saloon. Silas Brennan. The name tasted like copper pennies and old blood in Elijah's mouth. After all these years of false leads and cold trails, someone had finally seen the man who destroyed everything Elijah held dear. The sound reached him before he understood what he was hearing, a woman's voice tight with controlled fear, cutting through the wind. Then men's laughter, harsh and predatory. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip muscle memory from too many years of dispensing justice at gunpoint instead of from a bench. Through the frosted window of Morrison's general store, he could see the tableau clearly. 3 men surrounded a woman behind the counter, their postures aggressive, their intent unmistakable. The woman stood her ground with a dignity that reminded Elijah of someone he'd lost long ago. Someone whose memory still had the power to make his chest ache. He should have kept writing. For 15 years, he'd perfected the art of not getting involved, not caring, not feeling anything beyond the cold burn of revenge in his belly. But something about the way the woman held herself straight-backed and defiant, despite being outnumbered, called to a part of him he thought had died in the flames of his home. Elijah dismounted and pushed through the door, the bell's cheerful jangle, a jarring contrast to the tension filling the small space. 4 heads turned toward him, and for a moment time seemed suspended like snowflakes in still air. The woman was perhaps 30, with rich brown hair pinned back in a practical style and eyes the color of pine forests. Her face was angular, aristocratic, with the kind of bone structure that suggested good breeding fallen on hard times. She looked at Elijah with a mixture of hope and wariness, as if help had come before, but always with a price. The 3 men were cut from rougher cloth. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard, wore the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His companions flanked him like wolves, their hands resting near their weapons. "Store's closed, stranger," the bearded man said without taking his eyes off the woman. "Private business being conducted." Elijah's voice, when it came, carried the authority of 15 years on the bench and 15 years learning harder lessons. "Doesn't look like the lady's conducting any business she wants to be conducting." The man finally looked at Elijah properly, taking in the expensive coat beneath the trail dust, the quality of the weapons, the pale eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Something in that gaze made him reconsider his approach. "Look, friend, this doesn't concern you. Mrs. Ashford here owes money to our employer, and we're just here to collect." "Mrs. Ashford," Elijah said, not taking his eyes off the men, but addressing the woman. "Do you owe these gentlemen money?" Victoria Ashford's voice was steady, though Elijah could hear the steel underneath. I owe money to the bank, yes, but not to whatever collection agency these men claim to represent. The leader's patience visibly snapped. The bank sold your debt to our boss lady. Simple business transaction. Now you pay us, or what? Elijah asked conversationally, stepping closer. You'll what exactly? The threat in his tone was subtle as winter frost, but twice as deadly. The three men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that the stranger's coat concealed what looked like well-maintained weapons, and that his pale eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from having nothing left to lose. Look, mister, the leader tried again, his voice less certain. This ain't your fight. Funny thing about fights, Elijah said, his hand resting casually on his gun. They have a way of becoming personal real quick. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, but Elijah's mind processed it with the clarity of still water. The bearded man went for his gun, his face twisting with desperation and rage. His companions followed suit, their movements clumsy with cold and fear. 3 shots, 3 bodies hitting the floor. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of wood smoke and fear. Elijah holstered his weapon and looked at Victoria Ashford, who stood frozen behind the counter, her green eyes wide but alert. No screaming, no hysterics. This was a woman who had seen violence before. You hurt? He asked. She shook her head slowly. No, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Men like that usually work in larger groups. I know. She studied him with those forest green eyes, and Elijah had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he wanted to show. You're very fast with that gun. Practice makes permanent. She came around the counter, stepping carefully around the bodies. She was smaller than she had appeared behind the wooden barrier, but there was nothing fragile about her. Every movement spoke of a woman who had learned to be strong because weakness meant death. I'm Victoria Ashford, she said, extending her hand. I run the boarding house here in Copper Wells. Elijah hesitated before taking her hand. Her grip was firm, steady, and surprisingly warm. Elijah Cross. Well, Mr. Cross, you've just made yourself an enemy of some very dangerous people. Wouldn't be the first time. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Elijah felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought was as dead as his family. It was dangerous, this feeling. Dangerous and unwelcome. Can I offer you a room for the night, a hot meal? She glanced at the bodies on her floor. I have a feeling we should talk about what comes next. Elijah knew he should refuse, should ask about Silas Brennan and ride on before whatever was stirring in his chest could take root. But the wind outside howled like a living thing, and something about Victoria Ashford made him want to believe that safety still existed somewhere in this frozen world. All right, he heard himself say, one night. As they stepped over the bodies and headed for the back door of the store, Victoria paused. Mr. Cross, there's something you should know about Copper Wells, about why those men really wanted me to pay that debt, which is, she met his eyes, and for a moment he saw a pain there that mirrored his own. This town is dying, Mr. Cross, has been for years. The mine played out, the railroad passed us by, and most folks have moved on to better prospects. But some of us have reasons to stay that have nothing to do with money or opportunity. What kind of reasons? Victoria was quiet for so long that Elijah wondered if she would answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. The kind that keep you warm at night and haunt you during the day. The kind that make you protect what little family you have left, no matter what it costs. Before Elijah could ask what she meant, a voice called from the back of the store. Aunt Victoria, I heard shots. A boy emerged from the shadows, perhaps 13 years old, with sandy brown hair and eyes that were startlingly familiar. Not familiar in the way of déjà vu, but familiar in the way that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat and his heart hammer against his ribs. Those were Samuel's eyes, his dead son's eyes, looking out from the face of a stranger's child. It's all right, Ethan, Victoria said gently. Mr. Cross dealt with our visitors. The boy Ethan studied Elijah with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. You're fast, he observed matter-of-factly. Faster than most men I've seen. You've seen many gunfights, Elijah asked, disturbed by the casualness in the child's voice. Ethan shrugged. Living in Copper Wells, you see all sorts of things, most of them not very pleasant. Victoria placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. Ethan lives with me. Has for, well, for most of his life. There was something in the way she said it, a careful weight to her words, that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface. Elijah found himself studying the boy more carefully, noting the quality of his clothes, the way he carried himself, the intelligence in those eerily familiar eyes. Your nephew? Elijah asked. Something like that, Victoria replied, and Elijah caught the brief exchange of glances between woman and boy. Secrets. They were bound together by secrets, just as surely as Elijah was bound to his past by chains of grief and guilt. They made their way through the snow to a large, weathered building that had once been painted white, but now showed the gray-brown patina of too many hard winters. The Ashford boarding house, according to the hand-painted sign that creaked in the wind like a hanged man's rope. In person, the house was warm and clean with the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of someone who took pride in their work despite limited resources. Victoria led them to a sitting room where a fire crackled cheerfully in a stone fireplace, and Elijah felt some of the coldness that had lived in his bones for 15 years begin to thaw. Sit, Victoria commanded, pointing to a chair near the fire. You look half frozen, and I suspect you haven't had a proper meal in days. She was right, though Elijah couldn't remember the last time someone had cared enough to notice. He settled into the chair, which was surprisingly comfortable, and watched as Victoria bustled about preparing coffee and what smelled like venison stew. Ethan settled cross-legged on the floor near Elijah's chair, studying him with that disconcerting intensity. You're not from around here, the boy observed. No. Where are you from, here and there? That's not really an answer. Despite everything, Elijah found himself almost smiling. No, it's not. Aunt Victoria says that when people don't want to answer questions, it's usually because the answers hurt too much to say out loud. Elijah glanced at Victoria, who was stirring the stew with perhaps more attention than it required. Your aunt sounds like a wise woman. She is. She knows things. There was something in the way Ethan said it that made Elijah look at him more sharply. What kind of things? Before the boy could answer, Victoria appeared with bowls of stew and mugs of coffee that smelled better than anything Elijah had encountered in months. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside like a pack of wolves. Mr. Cross, Victoria said finally, what brings you to Copper Wells? Elijah set down his spoon and studied her face. I'm looking for someone. Who? A man named Silas Brennan. The effect of the name was immediate and dramatic. Victoria went completely still, her face draining of color. Ethan looked up sharply, his young features tightening with what looked like fear. Why are you looking for Silas Brennan? Victoria asked, her voice carefully neutral. He killed my family 15 years ago. I intend to return the favor. The silence that followed was heavy as fresh snow, thick with implications and secrets that Elijah was only beginning to sense. Victoria and Ethan exchanged another look, longer, this time more complex. Mr. Cross, Victoria said carefully, there are things about Silas Brennan that you need to understand, things that might complicate your plans for revenge, such as... She was quiet for so long that Elijah wondered if she would answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Such as the fact that he's my brother. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. He stared at this woman who had offered him warmth and shelter, who had looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of affection, and felt the familiar ice reforming around his heart. Your brother. My older brother, yes. And before you reach for that gun, you should know that I haven't seen him in over 3 years. That I left home because I couldn't stand what he was becoming. That everything decent in me has been fighting against everything he represents for most of my adult life. Elijah's hand had indeed moved toward his weapon, but something in Victoria's voice stopped him. Pain. Deep, abiding pain that echoed his own. Tell me, he said quietly. Victoria looked at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. Whatever she was about to reveal, the boy already knew it. Silas wasn't always a killer, she began. He was a good man once, believe it or not. Protective of his family, generous with his neighbors, quick to help anyone in need. But then, she closed her eyes. Then our parents died in a fire. An accident, the authorities said, but Silas became convinced it was arson. Became obsessed with finding the people responsible. And did he? He thought he did. Found some men who had been in the area that night, men with criminal records and no good explanations for their presence. He killed them. All of them. And when that didn't satisfy the rage inside him, he started killing anyone who reminded him of them. Anyone who got in his way. Anyone who couldn't prove they deserved to live. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. How many? I stopped counting at 20. Victoria opened her eyes and they were bright with unshed tears. I tried to stop him, tried to reason with him, to remind him of the man he used to be. But grief had eaten away everything good in him, left only hunger for more blood, more vengeance. So you left. I ran away in the night like a coward, yes. Took Ethan and ran as far as we could, changed our names, tried to build a life where Silas's reputation couldn't follow us. Elijah studied the boy who was watching this conversation with the intensity of someone whose entire world depended on its outcome. Ethan is his son, Eshael. No, Victoria said quickly, why, really. Ethan is... She looked at the boy again and something passed between them. Ethan is someone I found. Someone who needed protecting. There was more to the story. Elijah could sense the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air like smoke. But before he could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night. Many horses coming fast. Elijah was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun. Victoria moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her face grim. 8 riders, she said. Maybe 10. They'll have the house surrounded in minutes. Back door. Covered by now, I'm sure. She turned to face him, and Elijah saw something in her eyes that surprised him, not fear but resignation. Mr. Cross, there's something else you need to know about those men you killed tonight. What? They working for a man named Cornelius Black. And Cornelius Black has been looking for my brother for almost as long as you have. Outside a voice boomed through the night. Victoria Ashford. Send out the stranger and we'll discuss your debt like civilized people. Victoria called back without hesitation. Tell Mr. Black that if he wants Mr. Cross, he can come and get him himself. The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, bullets shattering windows and splintering wood. Elijah and Victoria took cover behind overturned furniture, returning fire when they could find targets. Ethan, to Elijah's amazement, produced a small revolver and checked its cylinder with the practiced efficiency of someone far older than his years. How long has this been going on? Elijah shouted over the gunfire. 6 months, Victoria replied, squeezing off a shot through a broken window. Ever since Black found out where we were hiding. What does he want with your brother? The same thing you want. Silas killed someone important to Black. Someone he loved. Elijah felt a strange kinship with this Cornelius Black, another man driven by grief and the hunger for vengeance. But that didn't make him less of an enemy. There's something else, Victoria called over the noise. Something about Ethan that you need to understand. Before she could explain, the front door exploded inward and 3 men charged through the opening. Elijah put 2 of them down before they could fire a shot, but the 3rd man's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Victoria's shotgun boomed and the 3rd man dropped. But more were coming through the shattered windows, and Elijah knew they were about to be overwhelmed. The cellar, Victoria shouted. There's a tunnel. They fought their way through the house, Ethan keeping pace despite his age, showing a courage that reminded Elijah painfully of his dead son. The cellar was reached through a hidden door behind the kitchen pantry, and as they descended into the darkness, Elijah could hear Black's men ransacking the house above. Where does the tunnel lead? He asked as they felt their way through the blackness. The old church, Victoria replied. Father Donovan will help us. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to move in single file. As they crawled through the darkness, Victoria spoke quietly. Mr. Cross, when we reach the church, I'm going to tell you something that will change everything you think you know about your family, about your son. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs. What about Samuel? Your son didn't die 15 years ago. The world tilted. Elijah stopped crawling, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. What did you say? Samuel Cross lived for almost 2 years after the attack. A woman found him in the wreckage, badly hurt but alive. She nursed him back to health, raised him, loved him. Who? The word came out as barely a whisper. A woman who had reasons of her own for hiding from the world. A woman who knew that if certain people discovered that Samuel was alive, they would use him to get to you. Who? Elijah's voice was stronger now, edged with desperate hope and growing fear. Victoria's answer came softly through the darkness. Me. The church was a small stone building that had seen better decades, its steeple leaning slightly to the north, as if the whole structure was tired of fighting Montana winters. Father Donovan proved to be a thin, elderly man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly as he led them to safety in the vestry. "They'll search here eventually," he warned as he tended to Elijah's shoulder wound. "But it should buy us a few hours." Elijah barely heard him. His attention was focused entirely on Victoria, who sat across from him with Ethan Samuel beside her. The boy was studying Elijah with new intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. "Tell me," Elijah said quietly. Victoria took a shaky breath. 15 years ago, I wasn't living with Silas anymore. I had a small cabin about 5 miles from your ranch, trying to make a living as a seamstress. The night of the attack, I saw the flames from my window." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "By the time I reached your place, the house was mostly gone, and your wife was already dead. I found Samuel in what had been the kitchen, unconscious but breathing. He'd taken a blow to the head and his left arm was broken, but he was alive." "Why didn't you take him to the authorities, to a doctor?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Mr. Cross, I had been living under a false name for 2 years by then, trying to escape my brother's reputation. I had no legal existence, no way to explain how I'd come to have a child. And besides," she looked at Ethan with such love that it made Elijah's chest ache. "He was hurt, traumatized. He didn't remember anything about the attack, barely remembered his own name. I thought, I thought I could give him a better life than he might have in an orphanage or with distant relatives who might not want him." Elijah stared at the boy who had been his son, trying to reconcile the 13-year-old stranger with the toddler he remembered. "Samuel." "The boy." Ethan looked up at him with those familiar eyes. "I don't remember being Samuel," he said quietly. "I remember flashes sometimes. A woman with yellow hair who smelled like lavender. A man who used to read me stories about knights and dragons. But it's like remembering a dream." "That was your mother," Elijah said, his voice rough with emotion. "Margaret. She loves stories too." "I know," Ethan said simply. "Aunt Victoria told me. She told me all about you, about who I was before. She said she was waiting for the right time to find you when it would be safe for all of us." Elijah looked at Victoria through a haze of emotions too complex to name. Joy at finding his son alive. Rage at the years stolen from them. Gratitude to this woman who had saved Samuel when he couldn't. Grief for all the moments they had lost. "Why now?" he asked. "Why tell me now?" "Because," Victoria said simply, "you're here. After 15 years of searching for my brother, you found your way to Copper Wells. Found your way to us. That can't be a coincidence." Father Donovan spoke up from where he was cleaning his medical instruments. "There's something else you should know, my son, about why young Ethan is so important to certain people." "What do you mean?" The priest looked at Victoria, who nodded reluctantly. "Tell him about the dreams," she said. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "It's nothing, really, just dreams." "What kind of dreams?" Elijah asked gently. "I see things sometimes, when I'm sleeping. Things that haven't happened yet, or things that happened long ago. Aunt Victoria says it's because I almost died that night. She says sometimes when people come that close to crossings over, they bring something back with them." Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana cold. "What kind of things do you see?" "I've seen you," Ethan said simply. "For years I've been dreaming about a man with pale eyes and sad face, always riding toward something terrible. And lately," he looked at Victoria, "lately I've been seeing Uncle Silas." "What about him?" "He's not the monster everyone thinks he is. Not anymore. Something happened to him. Something that changed him back into the man Aunt Victoria remembers. But there are people who want to kill him before he can make amends for what he's done. Cornelius Black," Victoria said grimly, "and others. There's a whole group of them people who lost family and friends to Silas during his killing years. They call themselves the Circle of Justice, and they've been hunting him for months." Elijah absorbed this information, his mind racing. The man he'd been hunting for 15 years, the target of all his rage and grief, was apparently trying to redeem himself. It should have simplified things, should have made his choice easier. Instead, it made everything infinitely more complicated. "There's something else," Ethan said quietly. "In my dreams, I see the three of us together. like a family. But it only happens if Uncle Silas lives long enough to find us. Outside, they could hear the sound of approaching horses again. Black's men had finished searching the boarding house and were expanding their search to the rest of the town. "We need to leave," Victoria said, moving to the window. "Father, do you have horses?" "Two in the stable behind the church," Donovan confirmed. "But they'll be watching the roads." "I know a way," Ethan said. "Through the old mining tunnels. They connect to a cabin about 10 miles north near Copper Creek. Uncle Silas used to take me hunting there when I was small." "Before he went bad?" Elijah asked. "Before he went bad," Ethan confirmed. "Aunt Victoria, you said he was trying to find us. What if that's where he's hiding?" Victoria and Elijah exchanged a look that was heavy with possibility and danger. 15 years of hunting, 15 years of pain and rage and loss, all leading to this moment. The chance to confront not just his family's killer, but the brother of the woman he was beginning to love and the uncle of the son he'd thought was dead. "All right," Elijah said finally, "we go to the cabin, but we go prepared for anything." As they gathered supplies and prepared to leave the dubious safety of the church, Victoria pulled Elijah aside. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Something Ethan doesn't know that I've never told anyone." "What?" She met his eyes and he saw a pain there that matched his own. "The night I found Samuel, the night your family was attacked, I wasn't alone. I had gone to your ranch that night because Silas had told me he was planning something terrible and I wanted to warn you." Elijah felt the familiar ice forming around his heart. "You knew he was coming for us." "I suspected, but I was too late. By the time I arrived, it was already over." Her voice broke. "If I had been braver, if I had come sooner, maybe your wife would still be alive." For a moment, Elijah stood on the knife's edge between forgiveness and rage. This woman had saved his son, had raised him with love and care for 15 years, had given up her own life to keep him safe. But she had also failed to prevent the tragedy that destroyed his world. Looking at her face, at the guilt and pain she had carried for so long, Elijah made a choice that surprised him. "You did what you could," he said quietly, "and you saved the most important thing. You saved my son." The relief in Victoria's eyes was so profound that Elijah felt his chest tighten with emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, gratitude, and something else, something that felt dangerously like love. They slipped out of the church as the snow began to fall again, three figures moving through the darkness, toward a destiny none of them could fully predict. Behind them, copper wells burned with torchlight as Black's men continued their search. Ahead lay the unknown, and somewhere in that darkness, Silas Brennan waited killer brother uncle, and perhaps the key to healing wounds that had festered for 15 years. The mining tunnels beneath copper wells were a labyrinth of abandoned hope carved by men who had chased dreams of silver and gold into the dark heart of the mountain. The three fugitives moved through the passages by the light of a single lantern, their shadows dancing on walls that remembered the sound of pickaxes and the dreams of fortune seekers. Elijah found himself watching Ethan Samuel with an intensity that bordered on obsession. 15 years of believing his son was dead, 15 years of grief and guilt, and now this boy walked beside him alive and strong and utterly transformed from the toddler he remembered. Every gesture, every word was a revelation and a reminder of all the moments they had lost. "Tell me about your life," Elijah said quietly as they navigated a particularly narrow section of tunnel. "What do you like to do? What are your dreams?" Ethan glanced back at him, and in the lantern light, his eyes seemed older than his years. "I like to read," he said. "Aunt Victoria taught me letters when I was small, and Father Donovan has been lending me books from the church library. I've read about knights and explorers, about places beyond Montana territory." "Do you want to travel to see those places?" "Sometimes, but mostly I just want to understand things. Why people hurt each other. Why some men become monsters and others become heroes. Why families get broken and whether they can ever be fixed." The wisdom in the boy's words hit Elijah like a physical blow. His child, had been thinking about the same questions that had tormented Elijah for 15 years. The difference was that Ethan seemed to believe answers were possible. "What do you think?" Elijah asked. "Can broken families be fixed?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think maybe they can't go back to what they were, but maybe they can become something new, something different, but just as good." Victoria, walking ahead of them, turned back with a smile that was both proud and heartbreaking. He's been saying things like that since he was 8 years old. Sometimes I think he's wiser than both of us put together. He gets that from his mother, Elijah said. Margaret always saw possibilities where I saw only problems. They emerged from the tunnels into a night that had grown colder and more hostile. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind carried the bite of true winter. Ahead, barely visible through the storm, stood a small log cabin that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. "That's it," Ethan said. "Uncle Silas's hunting cabin." Light flickered in the windows and smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home. "Could be a trap," Elijah warned, his hand moving into his gun. "Could be," Victoria agreed. "But we're about to freeze to death out here, and Black's men won't be far behind. Sometimes you have to choose between certain death and possible death." They approached the cabin, carefully, weapons drawn, but not openly threatening. Before they could knock, the door opened, and Elijah got his first look at the man who had destroyed his life 15 years ago. Silas Brennan was not what he had expected. The stories had painted a picture of a monster, a cold-blooded killer who murdered for pleasure, but the man standing in the doorway looked more like a scarecrow than a demon. He was tall and gaunt, his hair gone white before its time, his face lined with what looked like constant pain. His eyes, the same green as Victoria's, were haunted by ghosts that Elijah recognized all too well. "Victoria," Silas said, his voice rough with disuse. "I wondered when you'd come." "Hello, Silas." Victoria's voice was steady, but Elijah could see her hands shaking. "We need shelter." Silas's gaze moved to Elijah, and for a moment the two men stared at each other across 15 years of pain and rage. Then Silas looked at Ethan, and his face transformed with an emotion that looked like joy mixed with sorrow. "Samuel," he said quietly, "my God, look how you've grown." "Hello, Uncle Silas," Ethan said simply. "We brought your sister home." Silas stepped aside to let them enter, and Elijah found himself in a space that was simple but clean. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of coffee and beans suggested that Silas had been expecting company. "You know who I am," Elijah said. It wasn't a question. "Elijah Cross, former territorial judge, father of the boy my sister saved 15 years ago." Silas poured coffee for each of them, his movements careful and deliberate. "The man who's been hunting me since Helena. The man whose family you murdered." Silas flinched as if struck, but he didn't deny it. "Yes, that too." They sat around the rough wooden table, four people bound together by tragedy and secrets. Elijah studied Silas's face, looking for signs of the monster he had been hunting, but all he saw was a broken man who looked as haunted as Elijah felt. "Why Hadawa?" Elijah asked finally. "Why my family? What did we ever do to you?" Silas was quiet for so long that Elijah wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You did nothing. Your family was innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time." He met Elijah's eyes. "I was hired to kill you, Judge Cross. You had sentenced a man named Thaddeus Whitmore to hang for murder, and his brother wanted revenge. But when my men and I reached your ranch, you weren't there." Elijah's blood turned to ice. "I was in town that night. Circuit court session." "Yes, and my men. They panicked when they realized you weren't home. Started shooting before I could stop them. Your wife tried to protect Samuel, tried to hide him in the root cellar. But bullets don't care about innocence or bravery. You could have stopped them. I should have stopped them. I should have called off the job the moment I realized there were innocent people in the house. But I was young and stupid and drunk on my own reputation as a killer." Silas's hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup. "I let it happen, and I've regretted it every day since." Victoria reached across the table and touched her brother's hand. "Tell him the rest, Silas. Tell him what happened after." Silas looked at his sister, then at Ethan, then back at Elijah. "I spent the next 12 years becoming exactly the monster people said I was. Killing anyone who got in my way, taking jobs that no decent man would consider, drowning my guilt in blood and whiskey. I told myself that if I was going to be damned for what I'd done to your family, I might as well earn that damnation." "What changed?" Elijah asked. "Him." Silas nodded toward Ethan. 3 years ago, Victoria sent me a letter, told me that Samuel Cross was alive, that she'd been raising him, that he was growing up to be a good man, despite everything I'd done to his family. She said she thought I should know that something good had come from all that pain. Ethan spoke up quietly. I asked to meet you. After Aunt Victoria told me who I really was, I wanted to understand what kind of man could kill an innocent family. And what did you conclude, Silas asked with something that might have been a smile? That you're not that man anymore. That grief and guilt can change people in terrible ways, but they can also change people back if they want it badly enough. Elijah stared at his son, this wise, compassionate boy who had every right to hate but chose understanding instead. You forgave him. I forgave what he used to be, Ethan said carefully, and I decided to believe in what he was trying to become. Before Elijah could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night, many horses moving fast despite the snow. Silas was on his feet, instantly moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years living on borrowed time. 8 riders, maybe 10. They found us. Cornelius Black, Victoria asked. Black and his circle of justice, Silas confirmed grimly. They've been hunting me for 6 months, getting close every time. What do they want? Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew. The same thing you have wanted for 15 years, my death. The difference is they want to make it slow and public, want to make an example of me. Outside, a voice boomed through the storm. Silas Brennan, and we know you're in there. Come out and face judgment like a man. Silas looked at his sister, his nephew, and the man whose life he had destroyed. There's a back way out of here, a trail that leads to the mining big camp at Sunrise Creek. You can be there by dawn if you leave now. What about you? Victoria asked. I've run far enough. It's time to face what I've done. No, Ethan said firmly. We don't leave family behind. The simple conviction in the boy's voice stopped all 3 adults in their tracks. Here was a child who had lost everything, who had been raised by strangers, who had every reason to abandon the man who destroyed his original family. But instead, he was claiming Silas as kin, refusing to let him face his enemies alone. Samuel, Elijah said quietly, this man killed your mother. I know, Ethan replied, but he's also the man who taught me to fish and whittle and track deer through the woods. He's the man who told me stories about my real parents when Aunt Victoria thought I was too young to understand. He's Uncle Silas, and I won't leave him to die alone. Elijah felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening. For 15 years, he had carried hatred like a sacred flame, nurturing it, feeding it, letting it burn away everything soft and human in his heart. But looking at his son's face, hearing the forgiveness and compassion in his voice, Elijah realized that hatred had become a prison, and he was tired of being its prisoner. All right, he said, moving to the window and checking his weapons. We make a stand here. Victoria stared at him in amazement. Elijah, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He looked at Silas, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the monster of his nightmares, but a broken man trying to find his way back to redemption. Your brother saved my son's life by telling you about him. That counts for something. It doesn't erase what I did, Silas said quietly. No, but maybe it's a start. The battle began with shocking suddenness. Black's men opened fire from multiple positions, their bullets shattering windows and splintering the log walls. The 4 defenders took cover and returned fire, but they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. There's something you all need to know, Silas shouted over the gunfire. Black isn't here just for revenge. He's working for Thaddeus Whitmore. Whitmore's dead, Elijah called back. I watched him hang. His brother, Marcus Whitmore. He's been funding Black's circle of justice, using them to clean up all his brother's old business. The pieces began to fall into place in Elijah's mind. The systematic way Black's men had tracked them, the resources at their disposal. This wasn't just about justice for past crimes, this was about eliminating witnesses and loose ends. What does Marcus Whitmore want? Victoria asked, reloading her rifle. The same thing his brother wanted 15 years ago, Silas replied. To control the territorial court system, Elijah's the only judge left who can't be bought or intimidated. Elijah felt his world tilt slightly. He wasn't just a target of convenience, he was a target by design. And his family had died not because of random violence, but because powerful men wanted to control justice itself. The gunfight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. One of Black's men tried to circle around to the back of the cabin, but ran into Ethan's carefully placed rifle shot. Another attempted to set fire to the building, but was driven back by Victoria's shotgun. Then suddenly the shooting stopped. "Brennan, Black's voice cut through the silence. "I want to talk." Silas looked at the others, then called back, "Talk. You got nowhere to run this time, but I'm willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" "Send out the judge and the woman. Keep the boy if you want. You and I finish this man to man." Silas looked at Elijah with something that might have been respect. "He's not after you for revenge, Judge. He's after you because you're the one man in the territory who can't be corrupted." "What do you mean?" "Marcus Whitmore is planning something big, something that will require friendly judges in key positions. You're the biggest obstacle to that plan." Victoria spoke up from her position by the window. "There's something else. Something I learned from Father Donovan before we left town. Black's been recruiting more than just a circle of justice. He's been gathering every outlaw and gun for hire between here and California." "For what?" "An army," Ethan said quietly, his young voice cutting through the tension. "I've been seeing it in my dreams for weeks. Men with guns taking over towns, driving out sheriffs and judges and anyone who might stand in their way." Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. If Ethan was right, if his strange gift for seeing the future was accurate, then they weren't just fighting for their lives tonight. They were fighting for the future of law and order in the entire territory. "Time's up, Brennan," Black called. "Send them out or we burn you all." Silas looked at his sister, his nephew, and the man whose life he had shattered. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it. For the pain I caused, for the years you lost, for bringing this down on all of you." "Save the apologies for after we get out of the sea," Elijah said grimly. "Right now I need to know, can you still fight?" Silas's laugh was harsh but genuine. "Judge, I've been fighting my whole adult life. The only difference now is that I'm fighting for something worth saving instead of just fighting to hurt people." "Then let's end this." What happened next would be talked about in mining camps and saloons across Montana territory for years to come. Four people bound together by tragedy and secrets made a stand against overwhelming odds in a cabin that seemed determined to fall down around their ears. They fought not just for their lives, but for the idea that redemption was possible, that broken families could heal, that justice was more than just a word written in law books by politicians and judges. The battle raged through the night as snow continued to fall, and the wind howled like a living thing around the cabin. When dawn finally broke over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, only one side was left standing. And for the first time in 15 years, Elijah Cross believed that justice had truly been served. Dawn came slowly to the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold that reminded Elijah of better days of mornings when he had awakened beside Margaret and listened to Samuel's laughter echoing through their home. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was watching the sunrise from a blood-soaked cabin surrounded by the bodies of men who had died in the name of justice. 7 of Black's men lay scattered around the cabin like discarded toys, their weapons cooling in the snow. Cornelius Black himself had died just before dawn, cut down by a bullet from Silas's rifle as he tried one last desperate charge. The circle of justice had been broken, but the cost had been steep. Silas sat slumped against the cabin wall, pressing a bloody cloth to the wound in his side. Victoria knelt beside him, her face pale with worry and exhaustion. Ethan Samuel stood at the window, keeping watch for any survivors who might still pose a threat. "How bad?" Elijah asked, joining Victoria beside her brother. "Bad enough," Silas said with the grimace. "But not fatal, I think. I've had worse." Victoria's hands shook as she cleaned the wound. "You always were too stubborn to die easy." "Despite everything," Silas smiled. "Family trait, I suppose. Cross stubbornness and Brennan luck." Elijah found himself studying this man who had haunted his nightmares for 15 years, trying to reconcile the broken, remorseful figure before him with the monster of his imagination. It should have been simple evil was evil, murder was murder, justice was justice. But nothing about this situation was simple. "What happens now?" he asked. Silas met his eyes, and Elijah saw a weariness there that went deeper than physical wounds. "That's up to you, Judge. I won't run anymore. Won't fight if you decide I need to pay for what I did." "You want to die?" "I want to make things right. If that means dying, then—" Silas shrugged, then winced as the movement aggravated his wound. A man can't outrun his past forever. Eventually the bill comes due. Ethan turned from the window, his young face serious. Aunt Victoria, tell him about the dreams, about what I've been seeing. Victoria hesitated, her eyes moving between Elijah and Silas. Ethan has been having visions about what comes next, about choices we all have to make. What kind of choices? Elijah asked. Ethan left his post at the window and came to stand before the three adults, his presence somehow more commanding than his years should have allowed. I see two paths ahead of us. In one, Uncle Silas dies for his crimes, and you spend the rest of your life believing that justice has been served. But you die alone and bitter because revenge doesn't heal anything, it just makes the wound cleaner. The boy's words hit Elijah like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. And the other path, Elijah asked quietly, the other path is harder. In that one, Uncle Silas lives, but he spends his remaining years trying to make amends for what he's done. We become a family, strange and broken, and not what anyone would expect, but real nonetheless. And you? Ethan looked directly at Elijah. You learn to be happy again. Victoria wiped tears from her eyes. There's more, isn't there? Ethan nodded reluctantly. Marcus Whitmore isn't finished. He's planning to take control of the territorial government by force, starting with eliminating all the judges and sheriffs who can't be bought. If Uncle Silas dies here, if we don't stop Whitmore together, he succeeds. A lot of good people die, and justice becomes something that only exists for those who can afford it. The weight of destiny settled on Elijah's shoulders like a physical burden. For 15 years, he had dreamed of this moment, the chance to look his family's killer in the eye and demand payment for their blood. But now that the moment had arrived, he found himself thinking not about the past, but about the future. About the boy who had grown up wise and strong despite losing everything. About the woman who had sacrificed her own life to raise a stranger's child. About the broken man who was trying to find his way back to redemption. About the possibility that some things were more important than vengeance. Silas, Elijah said, finally, his voice rough with emotion. Look at me. Silas raised his eyes, and Elijah saw in them the same pain that had lived in his own heart for so many years. The pain of irreversible mistakes of lives cut short of words that could never be unsaid and actions that could never be undone. I forgive you, Elijah said simply. The silence that followed was profound as fresh snow, thick with implications and possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine. Silas stared at Elijah as if he had spoken in a foreign language. You can't, Silas whispered. I killed your wife. I destroyed your family. You did, and I forgive you anyway. But why? Elijah looked at Ethan, at Samuel, his son who had been dead and was alive again, and felt something shift in his chest. The ice that had frozen his heart for 15 years began to crack, letting in warmth and light and the possibility of healing. Because, he said quietly, my son is alive because of the choices you and Victoria made. Because hatred has poisoned enough of my life, and I'm tired of being its prisoner. Because forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something you're given, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to be worthy of it. Victoria was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, as she watched her brother and the man whose life he had destroyed find their way toward something that looked like peace. Silas tried to speak but couldn't manage words. Instead, he simply nodded, accepting the gift he had never expected to receive. There's something else, Ethan said softly. Something I need to tell you all. He moved to the fireplace and knelt down, reaching into a crevice between two stones. When he straightened, he held a small wooden box in his hands. I've been keeping this for you, he said, approaching Elijah. Aunt Victoria didn't know. I wanted to wait until the right time. Elijah took the box with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, was a small, leather-bound journal and a folded piece of paper. It was your wife's, Ethan explained. I found it in the ruins of your house when I was old enough to go back and look. The journal has things she wrote about you, about me, about the life you were building together. And the letter, he swallowed hard. The letter is something I wrote to you when I was 10. Aunt Victoria helped me with the words, but they're my feelings. With shaking hands, Elijah unfolded the paper. The writing was childish but careful, each letter formed with obvious effort. Dear Papa, Aunt Victoria told me about you and about Mama, and about the life we had before the bad men came. I don't remember much, but I remember feeling safe. I remember someone reading me stories and someone singing songs when I was scared. I want you to know that I don't blame you for not finding me. I understand that you thought I was dead, and I understand why that would make you sad for a long time. I want you to know that Aunt Victoria takes good care of me. She tells me stories about you and Mama, and she makes sure I know that I was loved even before she found me. I want you to know that Uncle Silas is sorry for what he did. He cries sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching. He tells me about the man he used to be and the man he's trying to become. If you're reading this, it means you found us or we found you. Either way, I hope it's not too late for us to be a family again. Not the same family we were before because that's impossible, but maybe a new kind of family built from all the broken pieces. I love you, Papa. I always have, even when I didn't remember your name. Your son Samuel, who is also Ethan Elijah, read the letter 3 times before he trusted his voice enough to speak. When he looked up, he saw that everyone in the room was crying, even Silas, who sat with tears streaming down his weathered face. When did you write this? Elijah asked. 3 years ago, Ethan replied, right after I learned who I really was. I've been carrying it with me ever since, hoping I'd get the chance to give it to you. Elijah pulled his son into his arms, holding him close, and breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his hair. This boy, this wise, compassionate, extraordinary boy, was his flesh and blood, his legacy, his second chance at everything good in the world. I love you too, he whispered into Ethan's hair. More than you can possibly know. As they held each other, Victoria helped Silas to his feet. The wounded man looked around the cabin, taking in the damage from the night's battle, the bodies outside, the blood on the walls. We need to move, he said. There might be more of them coming, and I need proper medical attention. Where do we go? Victoria asked. Helena, Elijah said, releasing Ethan, but keeping one hand on his shoulder. I still have contacts there, people who can help us. And if Ethan is right about Marcus Whitmore's plans, we need to warn the territorial government. They'll arrest me the moment that we ride into town, Silas pointed out. Not if you're in my custody, Elijah replied. I'm still a territorial judge, even if I haven't worn the robes in 15 years. I can place you under my protection while we sort this out. Silas looked at him with something that might have been hope. And after we sort it out, that depends on you. There are ways to make amends that don't involve dying. People you can help, wrongs you can right. It won't erase what you did, but it might balance the scales a little. They gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to leave the cabin. As they stepped out into the morning light, Elijah found himself walking beside Victoria, their shoulders touching as they navigated the snow-covered ground. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For saving him, for raising him to be the man he is, for teaching him to forgive when he had every right to hate. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked truly happy. He saved himself, really. I just tried to give him the tools to do it. And for teaching me that some things are more important than revenge. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes bright with tears and something that looked like love. Elijah Cross, are you proposing to me? The question caught him off guard, but as he thought about it, he realized that yes, that was exactly what he was doing. I suppose I am. If you'll have a broken-down old judge with more enemies than friends and a son who sees the future in his dreams. I'll take all of you, she said simply, the broken parts and the whole parts and everything in between. They kissed there in the snow with the Montana mountains watching and Ethan cheering behind them and Silas shaking his head with a smile that was equal parts amazement and joy. It was a moment of perfect happiness in an imperfect world, a reminder that love could bloom even in the coldest winters. 3 months later, Elijah Cross stood once again in a courtroom in Helena, wearing the black robes of judicial office for the first time in 15 years. But this time he wasn't presiding over the trial of strangers. He was presiding over the case of the territory of Montana versus Marcus Whitmore. The evidence that Silas had gathered during his years as an outlaw had proven invaluable. Bank records, correspondence, testimony from former associates, all of it painted a picture of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Marcus Whitmore's plan to control the courts through bribery and intimidation had been even more extensive than they had imagined. Victoria sat in the gallery wearing the simple blue dress she had chosen for their wedding the week before. Beside her, Ethan, who had decided to go by both names, Samuel Ethan Cross read from one of the law books Elijah had given him. The boy had declared his intention to study law himself to follow in his father's footsteps, but in his own way. And in the witness box, Silas Brennan testified about the crimes he had committed in service to Whitmore's conspiracy. His cooperation had earned him a sentence of 10 years hard labor, instead of hanging with the possibility of early release for continued assistance in cleaning up the corruption Whitmore had spread throughout the territory. It wasn't perfect justice. Silas would serve time for his crimes, but he would live to see redemption. The families of his victims would have to find their own paths to peace. But it was honest justice, the kind that recognized that the world was complicated and that sometimes the best you could do was try to make things better rather than perfect. As Elijah delivered his final judgment in the case, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 15 years of grief and rage and the hunger for vengeance. A chance encounter in a dying town with a woman and boy who taught him that love was stronger than hate. A confrontation with his family's killer that became a lesson in the transformative power of forgiveness. Justice, he said to the packed courtroom, is not about satisfying our desire for revenge. It is about creating a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur, where the powerful cannot prey upon the innocent with impunity, where redemption is possible for those who truly seek it. He looked at Silas, who met his eyes with gratitude and determination. Then at Victoria, whose smile could have powered the whole territory. Finally at Ethan, who was watching the proceedings with the intensity of someone who understood that he was witnessing history being made. The court finds Marcus Whitmore guilty on all charges and sentences him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As for Silas Brennan, the court accepts his plea agreement and sentences him to 10 years hard labor, with credit for cooperation in exposing this conspiracy. As the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests, Elijah felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since before the fire that destroyed his first life. This wasn't the ending he had imagined during those long years of hunting and hatred. It was something better, a new beginning, built on the foundation of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. That evening, the Cross family, strange and complicated and absolutely perfect in its imperfection, gathered around the dinner table in their new home outside Helena. Victoria had cooked a feast worthy of the occasion, and even Silas was there, granted a brief leave from custody to share in the celebration. To new beginnings, Elijah said, raising his glass. To found family, Victoria added, clinking her glass against his. To second chances, Silas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. To the future, Ethan finished, his young voice carrying all the hope and wisdom of someone who had seen both the darkness and the light that humans were capable of. As they drank and laughed and told stories late into the night, Elijah reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had set out to destroy a man and ended up saving him. He had lost a family to violence and found a new one through forgiveness. He had learned that justice was not about making people pay for their crimes, but about making them and the world better. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of winter and the hope of spring. And inside their warm home, the Cross family, judge and outlaw's sister, and the boy who saw tomorrow in his dreams, and the killer who had chosen redemption over destruction, planned for a future that none of them could have imagined just a year before. It wasn't the life Elijah had planned, but it was the life he had chosen, and it was good, very good indeed.